The peaceful suburbia of Maple Grove was about to turn into a war zone. When Greg Wilkins' obnoxious neighbor Steve decided to get petty, Greg knew he had to fight fire with fire. But the lengths he would go to reclaim his property would shock the entire neighborhood. Greg stared out the window, his knuckles gripping the windowsill. There was Steve, his neighbor of 10 years, deliberately parking his old pickup truck right in front of Greg's garage door. This was the third time this week. "That's it," Greg muttered, marching outside. "Steve, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Steve emerged from his truck, a smug grin on his face. "Just exercising my right to park on the public street, Greg. You got a problem with that?" Greg clenched his fists. "This isn't a public street, Steve. It's my driveway. You're blocking me from getting in and out." "Not my problem," Steve said, shrugging. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you built that oversized garage of yours. It's an eyesore, you know." Greg's blood boiled. Steve had always been a thorn in his side, constantly complaining about Greg's home renovations and property decisions. But this was a new low, even for him. "You listen to me, you son of a bitch," Greg growled. "Move your truck, or I swear I'll—" "You'll what?" Steve interrupted, stepping closer. "Call the cops? Good luck with that. There's nothing they can do. I'm parked legally." Greg's mind raced, trying to find a solution. He couldn't just ram Steve's truck out of the way. That would only land him in trouble. But he couldn't let Steve get away with this either. As Steve turned to get back in his truck, Greg had an idea. A dangerous, risky idea. But it might just work. "All right, Steve," Greg said, forcing a calm tone. "If that's how you want to play it, then fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Greg stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Steve chuckled to himself, confident he had won this round. Little did he know, Greg was about to unleash a plan that would change the entire neighborhood forever. Greg spent the next 24 hours meticulously researching local property laws and regulations. There had to be a way to legally reclaim his driveway from Steve's obstruction. And as much as he hated the idea, he knew he might have to get the authorities involved. That evening, Greg waited until Steve had gone to bed before sneaking out to his car. He drove to the hardware store and purchased a sturdy chain, a padlock, and a no trespassing sign. Back home, Greg carefully positioned the chain across the entrance to his driveway, securing it with the padlock. He then hammered the sign into the ground, making it clear that his driveway was now private property. The next morning, Greg watched eagerly from his window as Steve emerged from his house, coffee in hand. The look of shock and rage on Steve's face as he tried to pull his truck out was priceless. "What the?" Steve shouted, yanking the chain. "Greg, open this up right now." Greg opened the front door, feigning surprise. "Oh, good morning, Steve. Problem with your morning commute?" "You can't do this," Steve yelled. "This is a public street." "Actually, it's not," Greg replied calmly. "This is my private driveway. And since you've been blocking it, I've decided to make it off limits to anyone but me and my guests." Steve's face turned beet red. "You can't just do that. This is illegal." "Is it?" Greg said, raising an eyebrow. "I checked the local laws last night. As long as I have a no trespassing sign posted, I can restrict access to my own private property. And that includes your truck, Steve." Steve glared at him, fists clenched. "You're going to regret this, Greg. Mark my words." "I don't think so," Greg said, a small smile playing on his lips. "You had your chance to be a good neighbor. Now it's my turn." With that, Greg turned and went back inside, leaving Steve fuming in the driveway. He knew this was just the beginning of an all-out war, but he was ready for it. No more Mr. Nice Guy. The next few days were a tense standoff between Greg and Steve. Steve had tried to remove the chain and sign, but Greg had reinforced them both. Steve then parked his truck at the end of the driveway, blocking the entire street, but Greg simply called the police and had it towed. "This isn't over, Greg," Steve shouted as the tow truck pulled away with his truck. "You're gonna pay for this." "I told you, Steve," Greg replied calmly. "This is my private property now. You can't park here anymore." Steve stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. Greg knew he would have to be vigilant, but he was determined to win this battle. That evening, as Greg was grilling some steaks for dinner, his wife Jenny came rushing out. "Greg, you need to come see this," she said, a worried look on her face. Greg followed her to the front yard, where he found a group of their neighbors gathered around Steve's truck, which was now parked directly in front of their house, blocking the entire street. "What's going on here?" Greg demanded. "Greg, we've been talking, and we all agree that this has gone too far," said their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. "Steve has a right to park on the public street, and you can't just block him out like this." "This isn't a public street," Greg argued. "It's my private driveway, and I have every right to restrict access to it." "But it's affecting the entire neighborhood," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "We all use this street to get in and out. Your little feud with Steve is causing problems for all of us." Greg looked around at the faces of his neighbors, all of them nodding in agreement. He could see their point, but he wasn't about to back down. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but Steve brought this on himself. He's been a problem neighbor for years, and I'm not going to let him walk all over me anymore." "Greg, please," Jenny pleaded. "Can't you just find a way to compromise?" Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew his wife was right, but his pride was getting in the way. This was his property, damn it, and he wasn't going to let Steve or the rest of the neighborhood push him around. "I'm sorry, but my mind is made up," he said firmly. "This driveway is now private property, and that's the way it's going to stay." With that, he turned and stormed back into the house, ignoring the protests of his neighbors. He could feel the tension in the air, but he was prepared to escalate this conflict even further if he had to. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Steve continued to park his truck at the end of the driveway, blocking the street, and the other neighbors joined in, staging a rotating protest to make Greg's life miserable. Greg tried to reason with them, but his stubborn pride kept him from budging. He knew he was within his legal rights, but the constant confrontation with his neighbors was wearing him down. One afternoon, as Greg was leaving for work, he found the chain on his driveway had been cut and the "No Trespassing" sign had been knocked over. "Steve, I swear to God," Greg muttered, rushing back inside to grab a new chain and lock. As he stepped back outside, he saw a group of his neighbors gathered in the street, including Steve, all glaring at him. "What's the meaning of this?" Greg demanded. "We've had enough of your little power trip, Greg," Steve spat. "This street belongs to all of us, not just you." "I've told you, this is my private driveway," Greg shot back. "You have no right to be blocking it like this." "We beg to differ," Mrs. Thompson chimed in. "We've talked to a lawyer, and he says you can't just unilaterally declare this a private road. It's public property, and we all have a right to use it." Greg felt his heart racing. "So what? You're all just going to gang up on me now." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Steve said, stepping forward. "Until you remove that chain and sign and let us use the street like normal, we're not going anywhere." Greg looked around at the determined faces of his neighbors, and a sinking feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew he was outnumbered, and the legal battle he'd been prepared to fight was going to be a lot more complicated than he'd expected. But he refused to back down. This was his property, damn it, and he wasn't going to let a bunch of meddling neighbors take it away from him. "Fine," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "You want a war? Then that's what you're going to get." With that, he turned and stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. He needed to regroup and figure out his next move, because there was no way he was going to let Steve and the others win this battle. Greg paced back and forth in his living room, his mind racing. He couldn't believe his neighbors had the audacity to band together against him like this. After all the years of dealing with Steve's nonsense, he thought he finally had the upper hand. But now, with the entire neighborhood rallying against him, he was starting to feel the walls closing in. He knew he couldn't just bulldoze his way through this. He needed a more strategic approach. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He hurried to his computer and began furiously typing away, searching for a solution. It was a long shot, but if he could pull it off, it might just turn the tide in his favor. The next day, Greg emerged from his house with a stack of official-looking documents in hand. As he approached the group of neighbors blocking his driveway, he could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity and defiance. "All right, everyone," Greg said, raising his voice. "I've got something to show you." He began laying out the papers, carefully arranging them on the hood of Steve's truck. The neighbors leaned in, squinting to make out the fine print. "What's all this?" Steve asked, his brow furrowed. "These," Greg said, tapping the papers, "are the legal documents proving that this driveway is, in fact, my private property." There was a murmur of confusion and disbelief among the group. "That can't be right," Mrs. Thompson said. "The lawyer we spoke to said." "I know what your lawyer told you," Greg interrupted. "But let me guess. He didn't mention that this driveway was part of a private easement agreement when the houses were built, did he?" The neighbors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from defiance to uncertainty. "You see," Greg continued, "the previous homeowners had this easement set up so that the driveway was considered private property, even though it's connected to the public street. And when I bought this house, that easement transferred to me." He paused, letting the information sink in. "So, I'm well within my rights to restrict access to this driveway. And if any of you try to interfere with that, you'll be the ones facing legal action." The group fell silent, their earlier bravado now replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Steve in particular looked like he'd been punched in the gut, his face contorted with a mix of anger and defeat. "This isn't over, Greg," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I think it is, Steve," Greg replied, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "This is my driveway, and I'm the one calling the shots now." With that, he turned and strode back into his house, leaving his stunned neighbors to ponder their next move. Greg knew he had them on the ropes, and he wasn't about to let them off the hook anytime soon. The next few days were tense, but Greg felt a sense of relief. His neighbors had reluctantly backed off, no longer blocking his driveway or staging protests. He had pulled the rug out from under them with his surprise legal maneuver, and he knew they were now scrambling to figure out their next move. But Greg wasn't about to let his guard down. He knew Steve, in particular, was simmering with rage, and he could practically feel the man's eyes boring into him every time he stepped outside. One afternoon, as Greg was mowing his lawn, he noticed a strange car parked at the end of his driveway. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but the tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Suddenly, the driver's side door opened, and a familiar figure emerged. It was Steve. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Greg shouted, marching over to the car. Steve shot him a venomous glare. "Just making sure no one else tries to park here, Greg. Wouldn't want to violate your precious private property, now would we?" Greg felt his blood pressure rising. "This is still my driveway, Steve. Get your car out of here before I call the cops." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," Steve said, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "In fact, I think I'm going to park here every day, just to make sure no one forgets who's really in charge around here." Greg clenched his fists, fighting the urge to throttle the man. "You listen to me, you." "No, you listen," Steve interrupted, stepping closer. "This neighborhood was just fine before you came along with your big fancy house and your oversized ego. And now you think you can just waltz in and start making all the rules." He jabbed a finger into Greg's chest. "Well, I've got news for you, pal. This ain't over by a long shot. I'm gonna make your life a living hell until you crawl back into that overpriced hole you call a home and leave the rest of us alone." Greg felt his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted nothing more than to wipe that smug grin off Steve's face, but he knew better than to resort to violence. This was a battle he was going to have to win through smarts and determination. "You know what, Steve?" he said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Go ahead and park your car there. But just remember, this is my property, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else intimidate me." With that, he turned and walked back to his lawn mower, leaving Steve sputtering in frustration. He knew the war was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to come out on top. For the next several weeks, Steve's car remained parked at the end of Greg's driveway, a constant thorn in his side. Greg had tried calling the police, but they insisted that since the car was on a public street, there was nothing they could do. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood seemed to have retreated, no longer staging protests or confronting Greg. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they tried something else. One evening, as Greg was returning home from work, he noticed a strange vehicle parked in his driveway. His heart raced as he pulled up, worried that Steve had somehow found a way to get past the chain and lock. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't Steve's truck. It was a large construction vehicle with several men standing around it. "What's going on here?" Greg demanded, jumping out of his car. One of the men, a burly fellow with a hard hat, turned to face him. "Mr. Wilkins, I presume. We're here to start the driveway expansion project." Greg stared at him in bewilderment. "Driveway expansion? What are you talking about? Didn't you receive the notice?" the man said, frowning. "The city has approved a plan to widen this section of the street, including your driveway. We're here to get started on the construction." Greg felt his stomach drop. But this is my private property. You can't just come in and start tearing it up without my permission." The man shrugged. "Sorry, Mr. Wilkins, but the decision has been made. The city deems this necessary for the overall improvement of the neighborhood. We've got the paperwork to prove it." Greg's mind raced as he tried to process this new development. He had thought he had won the battle with his legal maneuvering, but now it seemed the city was trying to undermine him. He turned to the construction crew, desperation creeping into his voice. "Look, you have to stop this. This is my driveway, and I'm not going to let you." "I'm afraid there's nothing you can do, sir," the man interrupted. "We've been authorized to proceed, and we're going to do just that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got work to do." With that, the crew began unloading their equipment, effectively taking over Greg's driveway. He stood there, watching helplessly as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him. It was then that he realized the true extent of Steve's revenge. The man had clearly pulled some strings, using his connections in the city to orchestrate this entire operation. And now, Greg was powerless to stop it. As the construction work began, Greg felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had thought he was so clever, but in the end, his neighbor had outmaneuvered him. And now, he was left to face the consequences of his actions. Greg watched in dismay as the construction crew worked tirelessly, tearing up his once private driveway. He knew he had to do something, but every time he tried to intervene, the foreman would simply wave a stack of official-looking documents in his face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilkins, but the decision has been made," the foreman would say, a slight smirk on his face. "This is happening, whether you like it or not." Greg felt powerless, his carefully constructed plan unraveling before his eyes. He knew deep down that Steve was behind this, that his neighbor had somehow pulled the strings at City Hall to orchestrate this entire operation. As the days turned into weeks, Greg's frustration boiled over. He tried pleading with the construction crew, offering to pay them to stop the work, but they refused. He even considered taking legal action, but the paperwork the foreman had showed him made it clear that the city was fully backing this project. Finally, one day, as Greg stood watching the crew jackhammering his beloved driveway, something inside him snapped. He stormed over to the foreman, his face twisted with rage. "That's it," he shouted. "I'm not going to stand by and let you destroy my property." The foreman stepped back, his eyes widening. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down. This is illegal." Greg didn't let him finish. In a sudden, impulsive move, he grabbed the foreman's hard hat and hurled it at the nearest construction vehicle, causing a loud crash. The crew members scattered, shouting in surprise. Greg stood there, chest heaving, his hands trembling. In the stunned silence that followed, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Steve, a malicious grin plastered across his face. "Well, well, well," he said, slowly approaching Greg. "Looks like someone's finally lost their cool." Greg glared at him, his fists clenched. "You did this, didn't you? You set this whole thing up, you bastard." Steve chuckled. "Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But you've only got yourself to blame, Greg. You're the one who started this little war, and now you're the one who's going to pay the price." Greg felt a surge of rage, but before he could react, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Within moments, the street was flooded with police cars, and Greg found himself being roughly handcuffed and dragged away. As he was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, Greg caught one last glimpse of Steve, his neighbor's triumphant expression burning into his mind. In that moment, Greg knew that he had lost not just the battle, but everything. He had let his pride and his stubbornness blind him, and now he was facing the consequences. As the car pulled away, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so terribly wrong.